The morning of November 24th, 1944 began like any other on the island of Saipan. Pale light, low mist and the smell of aviation fuel hanging over Easley Field. Mechanics in oil-stained coveralls moved with quiet precision beneath the vast silver forms of B-29 Superfortresses. These aircraft were the embodiment of American engineering might, sleek, monstrous machines built not merely to fly, but to command the sky. At the centre of it all sat Lieutenant Colonel Robert K. Morgan, his gloved hand resting on the throttles of his aircraft, Dauntless Dotty. He was no stranger to war. His previous command, the Memphis Belle, had carried him through the storm over Europe. Yet even he could sense that today was different. Before him, the instrument panel flickered with quiet authority. Dials, gauges and needles whispering a truth that Japanese commanders still refused to accept. The engines roared alive. 4 Wright R3350 power plants trembling with restrained violence. Deep within their metallic hearts, twin General Electric Turbo-Superchargers awakened. Small spinning miracles that turned exhaust into power. These devices would become as decisive as any weapon ever mounted on wings. Each one transformed wasted heat into speed and strength, keeping those massive engines breathing freely at altitudes where enemy aircraft gasped for life. As the bomber rolled forward, sunlight caught the polished fuselage, a silver titan born from American industry. Behind Morgan, an armada of 110 Superfortresses followed in line, the target Tokyo. For the first time, the Japanese capital was within the range of regular attack. The newly captured Mariana Islands had shifted the war's geography, bringing Japan's homeland under the shadow of American bombers. The distance between Saipan and Tokyo, roughly 1,500 miles, was no longer an oceanic barrier. It was a runway. When the bombers lifted into the sky that morning, they did more than climb through the clouds. They ascended into a realm Japan could not reach. Their turbo-superchargers maintained full power as they soared past 30,000 feet. In that thin air, Japanese fighters would choke, their engines starved and weak. Inside the pressurized cabins of the B-29s, however, the American crews breathed easily. Oxygen flowed, instruments stayed steady, and the temperature remained bearable. They were safe inside machines that had turned the sky itself into an ally. 5 months earlier, on June 15th, 1944, the first Superfortresses had ventured against Japan from distant Chinese airfields. The mission had been ambitious and costly. 75 aircraft took off under moonlight. Less than 50 reached their primary objective, the steelworks at Iwata on Kyushu. The rest were lost to mechanical failure, weather, or sheer exhaustion. It was a warning of the difficulties that came with range and altitude, but also a revelation. For even that battered first raid proved that Japanese defences were ill-prepared to fight at such heights. Radar operators on Kyushu tracked the intruders. Sirens screamed across coastal towns. Fighter squadrons scrambled into the night sky, their pilots determined to intercept the invaders. They climbed in Kawasaki Ki-45s, twin-engine interceptors meant for medium-altitude combat. But above 20,000 feet, their Nakajima engines began to lose breath. Horsepower fell away, cylinders sputtered, and propellers spun with diminishing strength. At those heights, the Superfortresses glided onward, steady and unbothered. One Japanese pilot, Warrant Officer Sadamitsu Kimura, clawed his way toward the nearest bomber, forcing his overheating engines to the brink. He managed to close within firing range of a B-29 known as Limber Dragon. His guns spat tracer fire, and the great aircraft shuddered, trailing flames before plunging into darkness. Kimura's kill was a triumph, but a hollow one. His engines nearly failed on the return flight, and most of his comrades never even made contact. The raid had exposed an awful truth. Japan's air defense network had been built for another war, one fought closer to the ground. Inside those Superfortresses, gunners watched through crystal-clear turrets, their movements guided by a marvel of wartime computing, a central fire control system. Tiny analog circuits and gyroscopes calculated lead angles and target speeds faster than any human brain. With a squeeze of a trigger, turrets moved in unison, converging their streams of .50 caliber rounds on approaching fighters. To Japanese pilots, it felt like attacking a swarm of floating fortresses that could see in every direction at once. Captain Teruhiko Kobayashi, a respected fighter commander, later admitted that intercepting the American bombers felt like fighting shadows that struck back. The B-29s flew higher than any Ki-61 or Ki-43 could comfortably reach. Their speed at those heights, nearly 350 miles per hour, matched the best that Japan's interceptors could muster. To climb after them meant draining precious fuel and risking engine seizure. The higher they rose, the weaker they became. What made these bombers so untouchable was not just their size or armour, but the quiet precision of their technology. The General Electric Turbo-Supercharger, small enough to fit within a man's arms, changed the entire nature of flight. By using hot exhaust gases to spin a turbine at more than 20,000 revolutions per minute, it compressed thin air into something dense enough for combustion. It was as if each engine carried its own artificial atmosphere. This meant that while Japanese aircraft lost half their power above 20,000 feet, the B-29 retained nearly all of it. The result was a machine that could cruise at altitudes where most enemy planes could barely survive, let alone fight. Every one of those silver bombers was a laboratory in the sky, a fusion of metallurgy, mathematics, and manufacturing that transformed energy into endurance. Japan had once dreamed of developing similar systems. In 1941, before the Pacific War began in earnest, engineers at Nakajima had quietly studied foreign patents and imported technical samples through shadowy channels. They knew what a turbo-supercharger could do. They even attempted to build prototypes. But each trial ended in failure. The metals available to Japanese industry could not endure the stress or heat. Turbine blades cracked. Bearings warped. Balancing rotors to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch was beyond the capabilities of wartime factories, already strained to breaking. Lieutenant Fumio Niwa, an engineering officer who examined a captured B-29 engine later in the war, wrote with a mixture of awe and despair about what he found. The turbine blades, he noted, were machined so precisely that they could spin at full speed without vibration. The alloys resisted heat beyond 1500 degrees Fahrenheit, temperatures that would melt lesser metals. Even the bearings showed craftsmanship his own nation could not replicate. To him, the American turbocharger was less a component than a statement, proof that the enemy's industry operated on a level Japan could not reach. At General Electric's factory in Schenectady, New York, thousands of turbochargers were produced each month. Every single unit was tested under simulated altitude conditions, calibrated and certified before being installed. Quality control was ruthless. Defective parts never reached the flight line. By comparison, Japanese attempts produced perhaps a few dozen usable units in total, and most failed after a handful of flight hours. It was not ignorance that doomed the effort. It was the absence of an industrial base capable of sustaining excellence at scale. By August of 1944, Japan's intelligence community had come to a grim realization. Reports from pilots, radar crews, and engineers all told the same story. The American bombers could not be stopped. Colonel Takashiro Hattori, serving in the Imperial General Headquarters, wrote in his diary that the raids marked a new kind of warfare, one in which the sky itself had been claimed by the enemy. Fighter squadrons that did manage to engage returned with tales of futility. Even when shells struck home, the bombers absorbed the damage and flew on. The mathematics of interception became hopeless. A Japanese fighter climbing from ground level to 30,000 feet would burn a third of its fuel before even reaching the enemy. Once there, it had minutes, and perhaps seconds, to make a firing pass before descending again. Guns jammed in the cold, oxygen systems froze, the air thinned until pilots grew lightheaded. Many never returned, their engines failing as they tried to glide home. Major Makoto Ogawa, one of the few men who managed to destroy more than a handful of superfortresses, described those battles as fighting in slow motion. His aircraft would tremble and lose thrust as it clawed upward, every gauge edging into the red. When he finally reached the bombers, he found himself facing a wall of coordinated fire so intense that survival felt like luck rather than skill. In the rare moments when a B-29 fell, the price was usually another Japanese pilot lost to overheating engines or lack of fuel. By late 1944, Japan was desperate for an answer. The Nakajima Ki-87 was conceived as a direct countermeasure, a high-altitude interceptor designed to climb past 40,000 feet. On the drawing board, it looked formidable, armed with cannons, protected with armour, and powered by a turbocharged engine. In reality, the prototype barely flew. its makeshift turbo system failed repeatedly, coughing and sputtering under load. Even when it worked, performance was erratic. The Tachikawa Ki-94 never left the blueprint stage. Mitsubishi tried another path with the J-8M rocket interceptor, inspired by Germany's Me-163. It could reach bomber altitude in minutes, but only for a fleeting moment. Its flight time was measured in seconds, and its propellants were so volatile that one mistake could vaporize the pilot. The problem was not imagination, it was infrastructure. Japan's engineers knew exactly what they needed, but they could not forge it, build it, or replace it fast enough. Every failed turbine wheel, every cracked alloy was a reminder of how far behind their factories had fallen. Meanwhile, the Americans moved with relentless momentum. From the newly built airfields on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, the 21st Bomber Command began a campaign unlike anything the world had seen. No longer bound by the limitations of Chinese bases, they could now launch massive raids with full bomb loads and return safely. On that November morning, Morgan's 73rd Bomb Wing set its sights on Tokyo's Musashino Aircraft Engine Works. It was the industrial heart of Japan's aviation supply chain, the place where fighters and bombers were born. 111 B-29s took off in staggered waves, climbing steadily toward the clouds. The journey would test men and machine alike. Crosswinds howled, jet streams shifted, clouds turned navigation into guesswork. Yet the formation held together, a procession of steel and fire. Below, air raid sirens echoed through Tokyo's streets. Civilians looked skyward and saw the sunlight flash on silver wings. Anti-aircraft batteries opened fire, their shells bursting thousands of feet too low. The bombers flew at altitudes the defenders could scarcely reach. Their bombs fell like distant thunder, smashing into factories, rail yards, and fuel depots. For the first time, Japan's capital understood what it meant to be within range. Among the defenders was Sergeant Shoji Suzuki, an anti-aircraft gunner stationed near the city's outskirts. His diary, later recovered, told of pride giving way to despair. His unit fired dozens of shells for every fleeting glimpse of a target, yet the results were meaningless. The bombers were too high, too fast, too numerous. Even when one was hit, it rarely fell. Suzuki wrote of seeing a wounded Superfortress limping home, 3 engines smoking yet still maintaining formation. It was a sight that burned itself into his memory, a symbol of invulnerability. The psychological impact on Japan's defenders was devastating. Every raid felt like a test they could not pass. Every attempt to adapt fell short. When new fighters appeared, like the Ki-84 Hayate, perhaps the best Japan ever built, they were betrayed by unreliable engines and poor fuel. The aircraft performed brilliantly in the hands of elite pilots under perfect conditions, but those conditions were rare. Shortages of high-quality fuel, defective lubricants, and lack of spare parts turned promising designs into liabilities. Even the most skilled pilots could not overcome the odds. When they climbed high enough to reach the bombers, they encountered another problem: the B-29's defensive fire control. Each turret was remotely aimed and computer-assisted, capable of bringing multiple guns to bear on a single target. A lone fighter facing a formation of superfortresses would find itself under converging streams of gunfire long before it reached effective range. Few survived more than a pass or two. Captain Yasuhiko Kuroi, a veteran of the 302nd Air Group, wrote later that attacking a B-29 felt like rushing a wall of steel that shot back. The psychological strain was immense. Pilots who had been raised on tales of the invincible Bushido spirit now faced machines that could not be intimidated. Their courage remained, but their faith in victory did not. As winter approached, desperation deepened. When conventional attacks failed, some pilots resorted to ramming. In December 1944, during another raid on Tokyo, several fighters from Captain Kobayashi's 244th Sentai deliberately collided with superfortresses, destroying both aircraft in suicidal impacts. For every bomber that fell, a precious Japanese pilot was lost. The tactic was both heroic and hopeless. Courage without consequence. American crews watched in horror and admiration. Sergeant John McLaughlin, a gunner aboard the City of Los Angeles, recalled seeing a fighter slam into the tail of a B-29 beside him, both machines tumbling in flames. 10 American airmen and 1 unknown Japanese pilot vanished together into the sea. It was a moment that left crews silent long after landing. They understood that bravery alone was not enough to change the war's outcome. By early 1945, Japan's air defences were on the brink of collapse. Fuel reserves had dried up. Replacement pilots were barely trained. Boys sent into combat after 50 hours in the air, facing opponents who had flown hundreds. The gap between them was more than skill, it was systemic. The Americans, meanwhile, were preparing a new weapon of strategy, one that would turn the skies over Japan into an unending storm. The turning point came on the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, when altitude ceded the stage to fire. 334 B-29 Superfortresses slipped off the Marianas in waves, bays packed with incendiaries, throttles set for low, heavy flight. They did not climb for sanctuary, they descended into purpose. Tokyo's eastern wards flared as the first clusters fell, each canister blooming into rivers of flame that licked through wooden districts and leapt alley to alley. Wind became a bellows, oxygen a fuel, streets a chimney. Residents ran beneath a sky that roared like a furnace door. By dawn, a metropolis looked as if a giant hand had pressed it flat. 16 square miles of neighbourhoods were reduced to ash, and the toll in human life broke every prior reckoning. 14 bombers failed to return, a loss small enough, in the cold arithmetic of war, to make repetition not only possible but inevitable. Even in that low, brutal method lay the echo of the same advantage that had opened the campaign. Turbo-Superchargers had purchased choice, because the Superfortress could rule the high lanes, because its engines breathed sea-level air at 30,000 feet. Command could decide when to climb for precision and when to drop for weight. Without exhaust-driven boost, the China strikes of 1944 would have been suicide, the daylight raids over factories impossible, the crews too exhausted to sustain any tempo. The turbines gave reach gave endurance gave tactics room to evolve. The great lesson of the B-29 was not merely that it could fly high, it was that it could choose, again and again, how to fight. Industry kept the improvisation fed. At General Electric plants in Schenectady and beyond, test cells howled while inspectors measured blade routes and stators to thousandths. Any unit that warmed early or shook under load was broken down and rebuilt. On bomber lines in Kansas and Nebraska, nacelles met spars with practiced choreography, and by 1945 the number that mattered most, aircraft per month, topped 200. Each airplane consumed 8 turbo-superchargers, thousands of precision parts every 30 days, in addition to spares for a force already in the field. The supply chain moved like a quiet river. Ore to ingot, ingot to forging, forging to wheel, wheel to rotor, then onto a wing, then into the sky. It is not romantic to count pieces of metal, but war often turns on the things that do not fit on posters. Japan tried to counter at the point of contact and bled itself there. The Ki-84, Hayate, in ideal condition, could climb and fight with grace that impressed even American test pilots after the war. Field conditions were rarely ideal. Contaminated fuel detonated early and hammered pistons. Low-grade lubricants thickened in cold. Rush tolerances turned bearings into time bombs. The result was an aircraft whose design belonged among the best, but whose average service life drifted downward with every missing tool and every substitution made under pressure. Squadrons that should have flown the Hayate at its promise instead nursed it along the edge of failure. Those that reached the bomber altitudes met a second barrier: computation. The B-29's central fire control network allowed a gunner to command multiple turrets, while gyroscopic sights handled the trigonometry of deflection and lead. Fighters who approached from quartering angles were met by converging streams, as if the formation possessed one mind. Survivors of a first pass often broke away shaken, only to discover that the spent climb left too little fuel for another attempt. Others chose a tactic that ignored geometry altogether: ramming. It shattered metal and men in equal measure. Superfortresses fell, but so did irreplaceable pilots, and the calculus of exchange favoured the side that could build another bomber faster than the other could train another veteran. Escort changed the geometry of interception altogether. After Iwo Jima fell in March, P-51 Mustangs fanned out from its volcanic runways and met climbers long before they could threaten the stream. The climb itself turned deadly. Japanese squadrons, already thin from losses and fuel rationing, watched their last veterans vanish in scattered duels far below the bomber lanes. What interception remained became episodic and local. The great streams to and from the home islands went largely unopposed. The inland sea offered a clear measurement in July. More than 100 superfortresses crossed. American records note 2 damaged bombers. The defenders lost 23 fighters. The figure was not propaganda but bookkeeping, and it reflected a larger truth. The home front was unravelling. Cities across Honshu, Kyushu and Shikoku had already burned. Survey teams would later mark more than 60 urban areas, with 40% or more of their industrial districts destroyed. Railway bridges lay in rivers, marshalling yards were moonscapes, tram lines ended at craters. Factories that still had machines lacked electricity, workshops that still had power lacked coal, plants that still had both lacked workers who had left to find water and food. Against that exhaustion, the atomic missions rode the same engines and obeyed the same law of altitude. On August 6, 1945, Enola Gay levelled at 31,000 feet above Hiroshima, with oxygen systems routine, cabin pressure steady, and turbo-superchargers humming so the R-3350S held power in thin air. The bomb fell, and an era ended. 3 days later, Boxcar climbed for Nagasaki and repeated the demonstration. The airframes did what they always did, turned waste heat into manifold pressure and distance into a manageable errand. The weapons they carried changed diplomacy. The way they travelled testified to engineering. Pilots on the defeated side later described the contest without bitterness. Lieutenant Isamu Sasaki, credited with several B-29 kills, explained that victory required a perfect script. Surprise from above, the sun at one's back, an isolated straggler, and even then, luck. Anything less, and the formation's guns and altitude made the fight lopsided. Many contemporaries agreed. They respected the craftwork they faced and understood that courage spent against physics becomes attrition. Technical comparisons hardened the conclusion. Germany perfected layered mechanical superchargers and 2-speed drives. Britain turned that craft into an art, giving Merlins the breath to fence at high altitude. Japan tried both approaches while starving for alloys, precision tools and fuel. The United States alone chose to standardize turbo-supercharging on heavy bombers and then proved it could pay the price. Complex manufacturing, constant maintenance, a global supply of spares. That choice did not make the machine invulnerable. It made operations repeatable. Repeatability in war bends probability, and probability bends outcomes. After surrender, the United States Strategic Bombing Survey sifted records and ruins. Its authors debated the final dominoes, blockade, invasion, atomic shock, but agreed on the measurable state of Japan by August. Air defense shattered, production strangled, transport in tatters. Continued conventional raids would have driven the same lines downward. The B-29's range, pressurization, defensive network, and especially its turbocharged altitude made that pressure inevitable once enough aircraft were in theatre. What had seemed audacious in 1944, sustained strategic bombing from remote islands, had become procedure. The last mission lifted on August 14th. More than 300 superfortresses followed familiar corridors toward the capital region, released their loads, and turned home. No interceptors rose. Fuel was being hoarded for a last stand that never came. Crews landed to routine, ramps, jeeps, jokes, debriefs, and only later learned that a broadcast had ended the war while their engines were still ticking as they cooled. In peacetime, engineers took the legend apart with pencils and calipers and found what the crews had always known. Victory was systemic. Pressurization kept men clear-headed. Remote turrets kept fighters honest. Northern sights, when weather allowed, put iron where planners wanted it. Coral runways let heavy aircraft launch full. Threaded through those advantages was an invisible constant, exhaust-driven turbines that turned thin air dense and made long-range strategic bombing from island bases a sustainable routine instead of a gamble. Japan's technical community did not ignore the lesson. Many of the men who once cursed American blades and bearings spent the post-war years reshaping factories around the virtues those parts embodied. Precision machining, quality systems that caught defects before assembly, statistical control as a discipline rather than a slogan. Cameras, motorcycles, and electronics became the new products of minds that had once drawn interceptors on drafting paper. The admiration Fumio Niwa had felt handling a captured turbine blade matured into a national habit. Build exactly what you intend to build, every time. The Superfortress itself stepped aside as jets arrived. It flew again in Korea, then yielded strategic bombing to swept wings and turbines. Yet reputations lingered differently than airframes. When the two airworthy B-29s fly today, the crowd hears the baritone of the R-3350 and sees aluminum shine. But few realize that smaller machines inside those nacelles are still doing the quiet work, spinning, compressing, feeding, exactly as they did 8 decades ago. The visible drama sits on the wings, the decisive labour hums unseen within them. Through it all runs the human thread. Pressurization did not cancel fear. Flak still scissored through fuselages, fires still chased along cables, crews still ditched in cold oceans or disappeared into weather. Japanese pilots still strapped themselves into thin-skinned fighters and climbed into air so cold that breath felt like glass. Anti-aircraft gunners still stood to their pieces as silver shapes slid past the edge of range. The campaign's calculus was not a denial of courage, it was a measure of where courage meets constraint. If one writes the campaign as an equation, it reads simply, industrial capacity multiplied by engineering fidelity equals operational freedom. Operational freedom, applied without pause, equals strategic pressure. Strategic pressure, sustained beyond the enemy's ability to respond, equals collapse. The turbo-supercharger is not the only term in that chain, but it is the multiplier few nations could replicate. It turned fuel into more useful work at height, turned distance into routine, and turned the sky into a friendly medium for one side and a hostile vacuum for the other. For the defenders, the counter-equation never balanced. Training hours shrank as fuel vanished. Replacement airframes left the line with defects born of haste. Tactics evolved, from head-on passes to vertical dives to ramming, but every adaptation paid out of a dwindling treasury of experienced pilots. By summer, the curve stopped intersecting at a point of possibility. The outcome was not a surprise, it was an accumulation. Numbers closed the argument. By war's end, the B-29 force had dropped roughly 147,000 tons of bombs, erased vast industrial districts in more than 60 cities, and killed hundreds of thousands. Rail and road networks cracked. Coastal shipping dwindled. Factories that still stood found themselves unplugged from coal, power, and steel. Intelligence officers inside Imperial headquarters conceded privately by June that defeat was certain. Public words waited for the shock that made surrender politically possible. The bomber streams did not merely damage buildings, they dismantled the systems that made an army and a navy function. So return to the cockpit image that opened this story. Hands on throttles, needles steady, turbines spooling in nacelles the size of rooms. A pilot breathes comfortably because someone far away forged blades that do not creep under heat, ground bearings that do not seize, and balanced rotors that do not shake themselves to shreds. He is not untouchable. No airman is, but he flies within a system designed to make odds bow to craft. Behind him, a formation. Behind the formation, an economy that can replace what is lost and improve what remains. When the last wartime streams carved pale lines over the home islands, they carried more than incendiaries. They carried a verdict on the industrial age, that technology, reproduced faithfully at scale, erases distance and denies sanctuary. Turbo-superchargers were not emblazoned on posters, but they were the breath in the lungs. They made thin air thick for one side and left it thin for the other, and in that invisible exchange the fate of cities was decided. Today, when a surviving superfortress lifts for a crowd and circles under a summer sun, the sound that rolls across the field is layered. The bass note belongs to pistons and props. The subtler whine belongs to small turbines hidden from view. They still turn with elegant logic, compressing air so cylinders can drink and burn. They remind us that the decisive instruments of history are often the ones no one applauds. If the tale demands a last line, let it be plain. The silver bombers that crossed the Pacific did not prevail by myth. They prevailed because their makers could build, maintain, and supply the parts that let men fly where opponents could not follow, and because they could do it again tomorrow. That is why the sky above Japan for a time belonged to the B-29. The lesson endures beyond museums and anniversaries. Whenever technology, production and training align with disciplined logistics, air power becomes destiny. Whenever one falters, courage alone cannot bridge the altitude between intent and effect. That remains true today.